In this video, I'm going to talk a little more in depth about the changes to the bore between the Mark 0 design, the design that I initially went public with back in 2014, and the Mark 2 design, which is the design that I just recently finished designing the keywork for. Now, the most significant change, the change that I expect to significantly impact the tone quality of the instrument, has to do with the truncation. So, the subcontrabassoon, like the contrabassoon, the bassoon, the oboe, is a conical woodwind instrument, meaning it tapers from the reed end to the bell end. But of course, it can't be an actual cone coming to a single point, because then there would be no way to actually play it. So instead, all of these instruments are truncated to one degree or another. And this missing truncated portion of the air column is acoustically important. It forms part of the instrument. And the reed has to make up for this lost portion of the air column. This is why reeds for double reed instruments need to fall in a relatively narrow band of dimensions, otherwise the instrument will not function properly. On the Mark 0, I had chosen a truncation that made sense at the time, but as I started working on, or looking more closely at the reed design, I found that the reed was going to end up being only slightly bigger than a contrabassoon reed, and I was concerned that this would not give me the dynamic range and the power that I am hoping the instrument will be capable of. So when I updated the bore dimensions from the Mark 0 to what was then the Mark 1 and became the Mark 2, I increased this truncation. So by increasing the volume of the missing part of this cone, I will need a larger reed, which I'm hoping will give me the playing characteristics that I had talked about previously. The next two changes have to do with the overall pitch of the instrument. More significant of these two is what's called the boundary layer effect. So for the bulk of the air column on a woodwind instrument, you can simplify matters by treating treating air as though it were a ideal fluid, meaning a fluid or gas that has no viscosity. And the results are negligibly different than if you had factored in the viscosity of air. The boundary layer effect has to do with the layer of the air column that is directly in contact with the bore. It's in this layer where friction losses due to viscosity are significant enough that you do need to take them into account. Now, I did not take this into account on the Mark 0, not because I didn't know about the effect, but because, frankly, the math was really intimidating. There's no experimental data for the subcontrabassoon, of course, meaning I had to go back to the formulas for an arbitrary conical woodwind instrument. And if you want a brief taste of what I mean by intimidating, or at least intimidating to me, the professional contrabassoonist, non-mathematician, here are a few excerpts from a few of the pages of the the Netterveen Acoustical Aspects of Woodwind Instruments text that I used to derive or to estimate the boundary layer effects. Now, even though this effect is not linear, meaning it's not that different notes in the scale are impacted differently by it, and even different harmonics of different notes are impacted differently by it, it is overall a flattening effect to one degree or another. Next up is the temperature gradient effect. If you play a wind instrument, you'll know that as you play, the instrument gets sharper, and this is because the speed of sound is faster in warm air than it is in cool air. Now, on a small instrument like a piccolo or an oboe, the difference between the temperature of the air column at the top of the instrument versus the bottom of the instrument is not likely to be very large, and is probably fairly safe to ignore. And that's what I did on the Mark Zero. I assumed a average temperature between the breath temperature, which is pretty close to body temperature, and the temperature of the ambient air. But of course, on large instruments, there is going to be a significant difference from one end of the instrument to the other. Now, like the boundary layer effect, there's no experimental data for the subcontrabassoon, but I was able to adapt some data for the flute and the clarinet to suit my purposes. And once I figured that formula, I tested it against a regular contrabassoon. And the results were pretty well in line, so I feel pretty comfortable with the resulting formula. So for the Mark II, what I'm estimating is that a rather significant portion of the bore is going to be pretty close to ambient temperature. This will overall mean that the instrument needs to be shorter to compensate. Now, one advantage of this is that the subcontrabassoon should be less susceptible to tuning variation as it's warmed up, because so much of the air column is close to ambient, is going to end up close to ambient air temperature anyway. The disadvantage of this is that since so much of the air column is going to be at ambient temperature no matter how much it's been warmed up, it will be more susceptible to tuning change depending on the playing environment. But I mean, there's really no way around this, so I'm going to have to make do. The final bore change that I'm going to talk about in this video has to do with the geometry of the bends. So in order for a subcontrabassoon to be a remotely reasonable size, it has to be folded several times. So if we take two of those straight conical segments and we want to connect them, the most obvious way to do that is with a circular bend that continues the taper of the straight conical sections. And this is what I did for the Mark Zero. Now, the acoustic characteristics of this circular conical bend are fairly close to a straight conical segment, as long as the bore radius is small relative to the bend radius. So, like here is a large sweeping curve, where there would not be any real discrepancy between the physical length and the physical bore size versus the acoustic length and the acoustic bore size. But as you increase the bore radius and decrease the bend radius to produce the sort of bends that you would want for a subcontrabassoon to keep it as reasonably sized as possible, these discrepancies between the acoustic and the physical size of this curved segment of air column become significant. But what this really means is that this most obvious solution, the conical bend, is an acoustic compromise. The other problem with the conical bends from a practical point of view is that they are incredibly difficult to manufacture. Pretty much the only way to do it is with a CNC mill, which I don't have and don't have access to. So for the Mark 0 bends, I was going to have to outsource this work at a considerable cost. For the Mark II, I went with a different solution, which is a simple cylindrical bend. Here, both ends of the bend are the same diameter, and it's also the same size as the smaller of the two conical segments to which it's attached. Like the conical bend, this is also an acoustic compromise. However, it's actually somewhat more accurate when it comes to effective length and effective bore size than conical bends. It has the additional benefit that it is considerably easier to manufacture. You can make these in two halves on a regular lathe and put them together. In fact, this is how every contrabassoon top bend I know of is made. They are cylindrical bends, not conical. Now, if you add up all of these corrections together, you end up with an air column that is going to be 4.6% shorter on the Mark II than it was on the Mark 0. And on a small instrument, 4.6% isn't that much. On the Subcontrabassoon, however, 4.6% is about 560 millimeters, which is essentially an entire body joint. Now, I chose, instead of cutting off one full body joint from the end and repositioning all of the tone holes, I chose to make the overall instrument shorter and make each body joint shorter as well. I think this is the overall, the more elegant solution. Anyway, I hope you've enjoyed this more in-depth, frankly nerdy look at some of the Subcontrabassoon changes, and I hope you'll continue following the project. Have a good day.